It was October 1967, and the studio at Abbey Road smelled, as it always did, of valve amplifiers warming up, stale cigarette smoke, and the faintly chemical tang of magnetic tape. John Lennon sat behind the mixing console with his legs crossed and his fingers drumming against his knee in a rhythm that had nothing to do with music. The session was falling apart. Paul wanted strings. George wanted silence. Ringo said nothing at all, just twirled his drumsticks between his fingers and watched the ceiling as though the acoustic tiles might offer guidance. Once upon a time, and it felt, already, like a fairy tale, there had been someone to ring in moments such as these. Someone who answered on the second ring, no matter the hour. Someone whose calm, measured voice could untangle four egos with the quiet authority of a man straightening a crooked painting. The number was Chapel Street, 24 Belgravia. Lennon knew it by heart. His index finger drifted toward the telephone dial, touched the cold Bakelite, and stopped. The number still worked, presumably. Telephones do not mourn their owners. But the man who had lived at the other end of that line, the man who had found them, dressed them, fought for them, believed in them when no one else on earth would, and loved them with a devotion that none of them had fully understood until it was too late, had been dead for 7 weeks. Lennon pulled his hand back. He said nothing. He turned to the console and pressed the record button, and the tape rolled forward into the silence that Brian Epstein had left behind. Who was this person, whose absence could paralyze 4 of the most talented musicians alive? How had one elegantly dressed figure from a provincial city become the invisible axis around which the greatest cultural phenomenon of the 20th century revolved? And the hardest question of all, why had someone who held an entire universe in his hands been unable to hold on to his own life? To understand, one must travel back 33 years to a terraced street that smelled of fresh bread and furniture polish, and to a house where a small boy first sensed that between himself and the rest of the world there stood a pane of glass, transparent, impenetrable, and utterly without a name. The bell above the door of the North End music store rang with a bright, metallic chime every time a customer entered, and to the boy who grew up hearing it, that sound was the heartbeat of ordinary life. The shop on Walton Road, Liverpool, sold pianos, gramophones, and sheet music. It belonged to his family, the Epsteins, and it was the single fixed point in a childhood that otherwise felt, to the boy at least, like a suit cut for someone else's body. Brian Samuel Epstein was born on the 19th of September, 1934, at number 4 Rodney Street, Liverpool, a handsome Georgian terrace in the professional quarter of the city, where doctors and solicitors kept their consulting rooms, and where respectability hung in the air as thickly as the smell of beeswax on the banisters. His family were Jewish, immigrants from Lithuania who had crossed half of Europe in search of safety and found, on the banks of the Mersey, something better: prosperity. His grandfather Isaac had started with a single furniture shop and built it into a modest empire. His father, Harry, was a diligent man who ran the family business with the careful precision of a watchmaker. His mother, Queenie, born Malka, though she preferred the English name, was warm, anxious, and fiercely loving. She possessed that particular Jewish maternal gift for expressing affection and inducing guilt in the same breath. There was also a younger brother, Clive, born 2 years later. Clive was sturdy, uncomplicated, good at games, comfortable in his own skin, Everything, in short, that Brian was not. From the very beginning, something set the elder boy apart. Not talent exactly, though that would come. Not rebellion, though that too was brewing. It was a quality harder to define, a sense of dislocation, of watching the world through that invisible barrier. He was a pretty child, dark-eyed and sensitive, who preferred drawing to cricket. He spent hours sketching designs for clothing, jackets, waistcoats, elaborate costumes, while the other boys on Rodney Street kicked footballs in the lane. His father looked at the sketches and saw a future fashion designer. His mother looked at them and saw a child who needed protecting. Neither of them, not yet, saw the truth, that the boy was drawing armor. School was a disaster, not one school but several. By the age of 10, Brian had been expelled from or removed from more institutions than most men attend in a lifetime. The reasons were always vague. Not settling in, not fitting the mold. The real problem was simpler. He was different, and 1940s England did not care for different. He was a Jewish boy in a system built for Anglican certainties. He was an artistic boy in a culture that prized sporting ones. And he was something else, too, something he could feel but not yet name, a pull toward beauty and tenderness that the world around him seemed to find either invisible or alarming. At 13, he sat the entrance examination for Wrekin College. He failed. Another school was arranged. It did not last. The pattern was set. Try, fail, retreat, try again. Years later, when people marveled at his persistence in the face of record company rejections, they did not realize he had been practicing since childhood. Every closed door was familiar territory. In less than a decade, this boy, unable to last a single term in any school, would be commanding the most profitable enterprise in the history of popular entertainment. First, however, he had to survive Her Majesty's armed forces. In December 1952, Brian Epstein, aged 18, was called up for national service and assigned to the Royal Army Service Corps. It would be fair to say that the British Army had endured many trials, 2 world wars, the retreat from Dunkirk, the jungles of Burma, but it had never encountered anything quite like Private Epstein. He arrived at the barracks with a suitcase full of civilian clothes, which he wore beneath his uniform whenever he thought he could get away with it. He wandered into the officers' mess on his first weekend, sat down, ordered a drink, and was halfway through a gin and tonic before anyone realized he was not, in fact, an officer. When challenged, he expressed mild surprise that there should be a distinction. He visited the regimental psychiatrist so frequently that the psychiatrist began to dread the appointments more than the patient did. His official assessment, recorded in the dry, exasperated language of military bureaucracy, deemed him emotionally and mentally unstable, which was the Army's way of saying, "We have absolutely no idea what to do with this young man." The result was a medical discharge after approximately 10 months, around October 1953. Brian left the barracks with his civilian suitcase and his undiminished sense that the world was arranged incorrectly and that someone, sooner or later, would have to rearrange it. Yet the Army, for all its misery, had given him one thing. It was not discipline, nor camaraderie, nor any of the virtues that military service is supposed to instill. It was knowledge, private, dangerous, exhilarating knowledge. In the months following his discharge, in the winter of 1953 and the spring of '54, Brian Epstein had his first conscious sexual experience with another man. No name survives. no details. Only the fact itself, confirmed by biographers who spoke to those close to him, and the understanding that the barrier between Brian and the world now had a name. The name was illegal. The name carried a prison sentence of up to 2 years. The name, in 1950s Britain, was a thing whispered in dark corridors and shouted in courtrooms, and it would shape every remaining day of his life. For a brief, dazzling moment, there was hope of escape, not from himself, but from Liverpool, from the family business, from the suffocating expectation that he would spend his life selling pianos and keeping ledgers. In 1956, Brian was accepted into the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. RADA. The very name shimmered with promise. He packed his bags, took the train south, and for 3 terms he lived in a world where being different was not a deficiency, but a currency. His fellow students included Peter O'Toole and Albert Finney, 2 young men who would become titans of British theatre and cinema. Brian studied alongside them, absorbed their confidence, haunted the West End theatres. In the rehearsal rooms, he discovered something extraordinary. He could inhabit another person entirely, could slip inside a character, and wear it as naturally as one of his tailored jackets. For the first time, perhaps the only time, he felt he had found his people. The theatrical world was more forgiving of the unnamed thing, not accepting exactly this was still the 1950s, but tolerant in the way that artists are tolerant, with a shrug and a raised eyebrow rather than a slammed door. It did not last. In 1956, he was robbed on a London street, his passport, his birth certificate, his wallet gone. The incident shook him. Anxiety, always his companion, tightened its grip. Letters arrived from Liverpool. His father was unwell. The shop needed managing. The family needed its eldest son. After 3 terms, Brian left RADA without completing his studies. He returned to Liverpool, to the shop, to the smell of furniture polish and the chime of the doorbell, carrying with him the knowledge that he had glimpsed another life and been unable to hold it. The years between RADA and the cavern were outwardly uneventful. He ran the record department with an almost fanatical dedication, building a reputation as the man who could find any disc, fulfill any order, and maintain the most comprehensive stock in the north of England. He dressed immaculately. He spoke beautifully. He was charming, cultured, and utterly, corrosively lonely. But he was not idle. In 1961, he wrote a column for a small local music paper called Mersey Beat, titling it "Stop the World and Listen to Everything in It." The headline was a self-portrait. Here was a person who wanted the world to stop and pay attention. Within months, the world would oblige. It would listen not to his voice, but to the voices of 4 young men he had not yet met. He came home defeated, and then the city showed its teeth. To understand what happened next, one must understand the country Brian Epstein inhabited, not the country of the travel posters and the coronation mugs, but the other Britain, the one that operated in shadows. In 1950s England, to love as Brian loved was a criminal offence. The law was the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, Section 11, and it made acts of gross indecency between men punishable by up to 2 years' imprisonment with hard labour. This was not an antique statute gathering dust. It was vigorously, even enthusiastically, enforced. In 1952, the very year Brian entered the army, Alan Turing, the mathematician who had cracked the Enigma code and arguably shortened the Second World War by 2 years, was convicted of gross indecency after admitting to a relationship with another man. The court offered him a choice: prison or chemical castration. Turing chose the chemicals. 2 years later, he bit into an apple laced with cyanide and died on his bedroom floor. He was 41. This was the world Brian Epstein navigated. Gay bars existed, but they were traps, frequented by plainclothes policemen and by a particular species of predator who made his living from blackmail. Public lavatories were staked out by officers hoping to catch men in the act. The word used in police reports was cottaging, a quaint term for a practice born of desperation. When every other space is closed to you, you seek connection in the only places left, however squalid, however dangerous. In April 1957, Brian was arrested. The location was a public lavatory near Swiss Cottage in North London. The charge was persistent importuning, the legal euphemism for approaching men for sexual purposes. He was 22 years old, the eldest son of a respectable Jewish family, the heir to a successful business, and he stood in a magistrate's court while a clerk read out words that, if published, would destroy everything his family had built. The sentence was 2 years probation. The conversation with his father afterwards is not recorded in any archive. No transcript exists, no letter, no diary entry. Those who knew the family spoke only of a silence that settled over the house on Rodney Street like frost. Harry Epstein did not disown his son. He did not rage or weep or threaten. He simply went still, and in that household, stillness was heavier than any shout. Queenie held her boy and told him she loved him. The unspoken condition hung between them like smoke. No one must know. It was a formula that would govern the rest of his existence. The arrest might have been the worst of it. It was not. 14 months later, in May 1958, Brian was in Liverpool when he picked up a man, a stranger, a casual encounter of the kind that loneliness and illegality made routine. The encounter turned violent. The man beat him, took his money, and demanded more. What happened next revealed a quality in Brian Epstein that would define him as much as his taste or his ambition, a reckless, almost perverse courage. He went to the police. He filed a complaint. He gave a statement. And in court, in order to testify against his attacker, he publicly identified himself as a homosexual in Liverpool in 1958. In a courtroom full of strangers who would walk out into the streets of his city, carrying his secret like a lit match. The attacker was convicted. Brian won his case. He also lost something that could not be measured in legal terms. Word spread through the neighborhood, through the shops, through the networks of gossip that are the true nervous system of any provincial city. Customers at NEMS who had greeted him warmly for years began to look away. Acquaintances crossed the street. The whispers trailed him like a scent he could not wash off. What followed was a pattern that would repeat, with variations, for the remaining 9 years of his life. The search for connection. The bars, the clubs, the streets after midnight. The paid companions, rent boys, in the blunt parlance of the era, who offered the simulacrum of intimacy without its risk, except that the risk was always there. Robbery, violence, exposure, blackmail. Trips to Amsterdam and other cities where the laws were less savage and the nights less perilous. And always, always, the return to Liverpool, to the shop, to the family, to the mask of respectability that fitted less well with each passing year. He was not seeking pain. He was seeking warmth. The tragedy, and it deserves to be called that plainly just once, was that in the Britain of the 1950s and 60s, The only paths to warmth led through darkness. And then, on a Thursday lunchtime in November, a boy walked into the shop and asked for a record, and everything changed. The story of how Brian Epstein discovered the Beatles has been told so many times that it has acquired the smooth, featureless quality of a pebble rubbed by the sea. A customer asked for a record. The record was by a local group. The manager of the shop, curious, went to see them play. But history, when you press your ear against it, is never smooth. It is rough and specific and smells of particular things, and the story of the 9th of November 1961 smells of damp brick, cigarette smoke, sweat, and something harder to identify, something electric, something that crackled in the air of a basement on Matthew Street like the moment before a thunderstorm. The Cavern Club was not a club in any sense that Brian Epstein would have recognized. It was a cellar, 3 brick-lined tunnels beneath a warehouse, originally used for storing fruit and vegetables, converted into a jazz venue in the late 50s, and now given over, reluctantly, to the new noise of rock and roll. The ceiling was so low that the taller musicians had to hunch. Condensation ran down the walls in rivulets. The ventilation was non-existent. On busy nights, the temperature could reach 100 degrees, and the air was so thick with moisture and tobacco that breathing felt more like drinking. The disc jockey, Bob Wooler, a sharp-tongued man with an encyclopedic knowledge of Merseyside music, announced the lunchtime act, and then, spotting the newcomer at the back of the room, added with theatrical courtesy, "We have with us today, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Brian Epstein of NEMS." The 4 young men on the low wooden stage did not turn around. One of them, the rhythm guitarist, the one with the sharp cheekbones and the sharper tongue, had a cheese sandwich in one hand and a cigarette in the other, and was conducting a conversation with a girl in the front row that appeared to consist entirely of cheerful profanity. The bass player was tuning up with his back to the audience. The lead guitarist, the youngest, stood slightly apart with the self-contained stillness of a cat watching a bird. The drummer, the one who would not last, kept time on the rim of his snare with the mechanical patience of a man who suspected he was filling someone else's seat. Brian stood at the back of that airless cellar in his grey suit, his silk tie, his gold cufflinks, smelling of cologne that cost more than most of the audience earned in a week. He watched the chaos, the filth, the amateurish bravado, the leather jackets and the greasy hair, and the complete, magnificent absence of anything resembling professionalism. And something inside him, something that had been locked away behind good manners and family obligation, and the relentless, exhausting effort of being someone he was not, cracked open. Years later, in his autobiography, he described the moment with characteristic restraint. "I was immediately struck by their music, their beat, and their sense of humor on stage. But those who knew him said the truth was less measured. He was transfixed. Not by the music alone. He was a classical listener by training and could not, at that stage, have told a 12-bar blues from a fugue, but by something more fundamental. He was watching 4 young men who were entirely, defiantly, unapologetically themselves. They ate on stage because they were hungry. They swore because they felt like it. They turned their backs on the audience because the audience would wait. They were free in a way that Brian Epstein had never been free, and in his heart, knew he never would be. The question that has been asked 1,000 times, Did he fall in love with John Lennon that afternoon? Misses the point. Perhaps he did. Lennon was magnetic, cruel, funny, beautiful in a rough-hewn way, radiating a dangerous energy that drew people in and burned them. But what Epstein fell in love with, there in the sweltering dark, was not a person. It was an idea, the idea of someone who could stand before the world and say, "This is who I am. Take it or leave it." The difference between loving a person and loving what that person represents would define everything that followed. In early December 1961, he invited the group to his office at NEMS on Whitecapel Street. They were late, all of them except George Harrison, who arrived precisely on time, a detail that told you everything you needed to know about Harrison, then and for the rest of his life. When the others finally strolled in, Lennon glanced around the tidy office with its neatly stacked ledgers and said something along the lines of, "Very posh. Are we in trouble?" Epstein laid out his vision. He would manage them. He would secure a recording contract. He would make them famous. The four listened with the tolerant skepticism of young men who had heard promises before. But something about this figure, his certainty, his seriousness, the evident fact that he believed what he was saying with a fervor that bordered on the religious, gave them pause. McCartney, with the pragmatism that would characterize his entire career, recalled the moment with disarming honesty. "We liked that he was in a suit and had money. We thought, well, if he's rich, he must be clever." On the 24th of January 1962, in the NEMS office on Whitecapel, the contract was signed. All four Beatles put their names to it. Epstein did not. Deliberately, pointedly, he left his own copy unsigned. When his assistant, Alastair Taylor, asked why, the answer was simple. It was so the group could leave whenever they wished. He wanted them to stay because they chose to, not because a piece of paper compelled them. It was, in retrospect, the most revealing act of his life. A man who did not believe he could be loved voluntarily had written an escape clause into the only relationship that mattered to him. He gave them the freedom to walk away and then spent the remaining 5 years of his life terrified that they would. What followed was a transformation, and like all true transformations, it worked in both directions. Epstein remade the Beatles, and the Beatles, without knowing it, remade him. The changes he imposed have become legendary. The matching suits, replacing the leather jackets and jeans of their Hamburg days, the synchronized bows at the end of each number, the absolute prohibition on eating, drinking, smoking, or swearing on stage. He drew up set lists, timed the gaps between songs, choreographed the curtain calls. He insisted on the mop-top haircuts that would become the most recognizable silhouette in popular culture, not a hairdresser's whim but a calculated element of strategy, though the word brand had not yet entered the vocabulary of pop music. In essence, he dressed them in his own armor. He could not be free himself. The law, his family, his nature, all conspired to keep him behind a facade, but he could make their freedom presentable. He could take the raw, thrilling chaos of the cavern and wrap it in a package that the BBC and the record companies and the mothers of teenage girls would find acceptable. He was not taming them. He was translating them. In return, the Beatles gave him something no amount of money or respectability could buy. They gave him a family, chaotic, irreverent, maddening, and entirely without shame. They called him Eppie, a nickname that Lennon coined and that carried within its 2 syllables everything the relationship was: affectionate, slightly mocking, proprietary. They teased him. They exasperated him. They made him feel for the first time in his careful life that he belonged. Now came the hardest part. He had found them. He had polished them. He had to sell them. And the world did not want to buy. In the early months of 1962, Epstein carried a demonstration tape from door to door across London with the tenacity of a man delivering a message he believed to be divine. Decca Records auditioned the group on the 1st of January, an inauspicious date, as the executives were nursing hangovers, and turned them down. The words attributed to Dick Rowe of Decca have become the most famous misjudgment in the history of recorded sound. Guitar groups are on their way out, Mr. Epstein. Whether Rowe said precisely that, or something less quotable, the meaning was clear. No. Pi said no. Phillips said no. Columbia said no. HMV said no. Each rejection landed on Epstein like a physical blow. They had not merely declined to sign a group. They had refused to believe in his discovery. And for someone whose entire life had been a series of closed doors, the schools, the army, the academy, the society that criminalized his nature, each no from a London record executive carried the cumulative weight of every no that had come before. Then, in February, through a circuitous chain of introductions involving a music publisher named Sid Coleman, he found his way to the one man in the British recording industry who was willing to listen. George Martin ran Parlophone, a subsidiary of EMI that specialized in comedy records and was considered the least prestigious label in the company's stable. Martin listened to the demonstration tape without enthusiasm. The music did not move him. But the man sitting across his desk, immaculate, earnest, vibrating with a conviction that seemed to radiate like heat, interested him greatly. I wasn't terribly impressed by the tape, Martin would recall, but I was impressed by him. He believed in those boys with every fiber of his being. On the 6th of June 1962, the Beatles came to Abbey Road Studios for a test session. On the 4th of September, they returned for their first proper recording date. Love Me Do was finalized on the 11th of September, with a session drummer named Andy White on the final version, a slight that Ringo Starr would remember with good-humored resignation for decades. The record was released in October. It reached number 17. It was not a sensation. It was a beginning. But between the contract with Parlophone and the first session, Epstein performed an act that would haunt him, the first time he exercised power over another person's life, and the last time he would do so without fully understanding the cost. On the 16th of August 1962, he called Pete Best into his office. Best had been the Beatles' drummer for 2 years, through the Hamburg residencies, the cavern sessions, the long months of rejection. He was popular with the fans, handsome in a brooding way, and completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. Epstein told him he was out. The reasons given were musical. George Martin wanted a different sound. The other three preferred Ringo Starr, whose style they found looser and more inventive. There were rumors of another motive, whispers that Best had once declined a personal invitation from the manager. Best himself denied this, firmly and consistently, throughout his life. The truth, in all likelihood, is simpler. Best did not fit, and Epstein, whose entire philosophy was built on the idea of a flawless ensemble, could not tolerate an imperfect element. The manner of the dismissal was telling. He delivered the news himself. He did not delegate, did not hide behind a letter or a telephone call. He sat across the desk from a young man whose life he was about to shatter and said the words to his face. When Best left the office, Epstein sat alone for a long time. The consequences were immediate and faintly absurd. Best's female admirers staged something approaching a riot outside the Cavern Club. George Harrison was punched in the face and came away with a black eye. McCartney was spat upon. Ringo, the innocent beneficiary of the upheaval, kept a low profile and waited for the storm to pass. It passed. Storms always do. But the episode left a mark that Epstein never discussed, and that those around him could only infer from the care, the almost excessive gentleness, with which he handled every subsequent personnel decision. He had learned that the power to create also contains the power to destroy, and the knowledge sat uneasily with a man who could not bear to cause pain. On the 13th of October 1963, the Beatles appeared on Sunday night at the London Palladium, and 15 million people watched. Girls screamed so loudly that the sound engineer in the control room pulled off his headphones in alarm. The following morning, every newspaper in Britain carried the same word above the same photograph of 4 grinning young men and a crowd of hysterical teenagers. The word had never been printed before: Beatlemania. On the 9th of February 1964, they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in New York, and 73 million Americans watched, the largest television audience in history at that date. It was said that during the hour the program aired, not a single major crime was reported in the whole of New York City. The claim, whether literal truth or urban legend, speaks to the scale of the event. For 60 minutes, an entire nation stopped what it was doing and stared at the same screen. And where was Brian Epstein while the world lost its mind? He was behind the cameras. During the Sullivan broadcast, he stood in the wings, in the darkness beyond the reach of the studio lights, watching 4 young men whom he had found in a cellar less than 3 years earlier being adored by a nation. His name was not on the screen. His face was unknown to the public. He had not given an interview. He had not posed for a photograph. He was, by design and by instinct, somewhere the spotlight could not reach. The financial architecture of Beatlemania, however, bore his fingerprints, and not always to his credit. The most damaging error was the merchandising deal with a company called Celtib, Beatles spelled backwards, which Epstein negotiated in the early days of the group's fame. The terms were catastrophic. Celtib retained 90% of the profits from Beatles merchandise. The wigs, the lunchboxes, the bubblegum cards, the pillowcases, and for every pound they generated, 9p went to strangers. When the scale of the miscalculation became clear, the deal was partially renegotiated, but the damage was enormous. Lennon was cutting. Our Eppie ripped us off. Then, shifting mood in the mercurial way that made him both impossible and irresistible, he softened. He's not a crook. He just can't count. It was not the only financial irregularity. Concert promoters paid in cash, brown envelopes stuffed with banknotes, handed over backstage after the last encore. The practice was standard for the era, but it left no paper trail, and a portion of the money, by several accounts, found its way to the gambling tables. Epstein gambled with the compulsive intensity of a man trying to feel something, anything, that was not loneliness. One documented evening alone cost him £20,000, and a gold Dunhill lighter, lost to the bays of a West End casino. By day, Brian Epstein was the most successful manager in the history of popular music. a man who had expanded his roster to include Jerry and the Pacemakers, Billy J. Kramer and Cilla Black, transforming Liverpool into the capital of British pop. By night, he was something else entirely, and the distance between the two was growing wider with every passing month. By day, 73 million viewers. By night, one man in a silent flat, dialing a number that existed in no telephone directory. A typical day in the life of Brian Epstein in 1964 looked, from the outside, like an exercise in flawless choreography. He rose early, bathed, dressed in a suit cut on Savile Row, always dark, always crisp, always with cufflinks that caught the light like small declarations of intent, and was at his desk by 9. The morning was consumed by telephone calls, to agents, to promoters, to the BBC, to the press office, to Abbey Road, to the 4 young men who were rapidly becoming the most famous human beings on the planet, and who still, with an endearing mixture of gratitude and insolence, expected him to sort out everything from concert schedules to domestic crises. When Cynthia Lennon gave birth to Julian in April 1963, it was Epstein who paid for the private clinic. It was Epstein who sent the flowers. It was Epstein who arranged for the birth to be kept from the press, because a married Beatle, particularly John Lennon, whose appeal rested on a studied air of dangerous availability, was a commercial liability. When Lennon married Cynthia on the 23rd of August 1962, in a brief, furtive ceremony at the Mount Pleasant Register office in Liverpool, it was Epstein who served as best man, who organized the modest reception, who paid for lunch at Reese's Cafe afterwards. 3 years later, on the 11th of February 1965, when Ringo Starr married Maureen Cox, Epstein was again the witness, the organizer, the figure standing just outside the frame of the wedding photographs, making certain that everything was perfect for everyone except himself. He remembered birthdays. He bought gifts, thoughtful ones, chosen with the care of a man who understood that the right present is a form of listening. He resolved disputes, soothed egos, mediated between 4 personalities that were, by their nature, centrifugal, always spinning outward, away from one another, held in orbit only by the gravitational pull of music and by the steady, patient presence of the man they called Epi. He was, in every meaningful sense, the parent of a family he had chosen, and like all parents, he gave more than he received and pretended not to notice the imbalance. Within the inner circle, the tight, insular world of Beatles and their immediate entourage, teasing was permitted. Lennon could make sly remarks about playing a bit faggy. McCartney could roll his eyes. These were the liberties of family, granted and accepted with the unspoken understanding that they went no further than the room. But if an outsider tried the same, a journalist fishing for gossip, a promoter making a snide remark, a casual acquaintance who thought himself clever, the response was swift, unified, and merciless. Lennon demanded apologies. McCartney refused interviews. All 4 closed ranks with the instinctive solidarity of brothers defending one of their own. The message was unmistakable. He is ours, and only we decide what is permitted. It was one of the few contexts in which the Beatles acted as a single entity without argument, without negotiation, and without exception. That was the daytime. When darkness fell, a different man emerged. Picture a night in 1965. The hour is midnight. The house on Chapel Street, number 24, Belgravia, A handsome Georgian townhouse in one of London's most expensive postcodes stands silent. Antonio, the Spanish housekeeper, left at 10. The rooms are large, beautifully furnished and hollow. In the drawing room, a gramophone stands on a walnut cabinet, but no record turns. In the kitchen, a glass and a bottle of whiskey sit on the counter, the bottle noticeably lower than it was at dinner. Upstairs, in the bedroom, Brian Epstein opens the drawer of his bedside table. Inside, a bottle of carbrital, a barbiturate compound, carbromal mixed with pentobarbital, prescribed for insomnia. Beside it, a smaller bottle of amphetamines, prescribed for the exhaustion that the insomnia produces. The two drugs chase each other in an endless circle, one to sleep, one to wake, one to sleep again. He takes the carbrital, lies back, closes his eyes, and waits for the chemical tide to pull him under. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it does not, and at 3 in the morning he is pacing the drawing room in his dressing gown, picking up the telephone, dialing numbers, friends, acquaintances, anyone who might answer. Sometimes he rings the Beatles, sometimes his mother. Sometimes he dials, listens to the ringing tone for 30 seconds, and replaces the receiver without speaking. On other nights, he goes out. The bars and clubs of Soho and the West End, places with no signs above their doors, places found by knowing someone who knew someone, offered what Chapel Street could not. The presence of other human beings, the possibility of touch, the illusion that loneliness was a condition with a cure. He dressed for these expeditions in something more casual, less identifiable, and moved through the nocturnal geography of gay London with the practiced wariness of a man who understood that every encounter carried a price, sometimes financial, sometimes physical, sometimes worse. The paid companions were a regular feature of these nights. The transactions were straightforward. Money exchanged for the approximation of intimacy, a few hours in which the barrier between Brian and the world thinned to almost nothing. Almost. Because even in these moments, he was performing a calculation, how much trust to extend, how much of himself to reveal, how quickly to leave. Every young man who accepted his money also possessed, from that moment, the power to destroy him. A word to a newspaper, a threat whispered at a stage door, and the career of the most successful manager in popular music would be finished. And the threats came. Between 1964 and 1967, by the account of those close to him, he was blackmailed on at least 2 or 3 serious occasions. He paid. He always paid. Silently, without telling the Beatles, without telling his mother, without telling anyone except, perhaps, his solicitor. In the final months of his life, according to accounts that surfaced decades later, a companion known as Diz Gillespie may have stolen money and documents from the house on Chapel Street. The details remain disputed. The pattern does not. There was no long-term partner, no steady companion, no one who stayed through the night and was still there in the morning. Every biographer who has examined his personal life arrives at the same bleak conclusion. Brian Epstein, who gave 4 young men a sense of belonging that changed the world, never found that belonging for himself. And then there was John. In April 1963, Brian Epstein and John Lennon traveled together to Spain. Just the two of them. No other Beatles, no wives, no entourage, no schedule. 12 days in Barcelona, paid for by Epstein. They stayed in good hotels. They ate in restaurants along Las Ramblas. They walked the old streets of the Gothic Quarter. where the shadows of medieval buildings fell across the pavement like dark water, and the air smelled of frying anchovies and cigar smoke, and something older, stone, perhaps, or history, or the specific freedom that comes from being far from home. What happened during those 12 days has been the subject of more speculation than almost any other episode in the Beatles story, and the honest answer is, nobody knows. Not fully, not for certain. What Lennon himself said, years later, is a matter of record. In his sprawling interview with Jan Wenner for Rolling Stone in 1971, he addressed it with the elliptical candor that was his trademark. It was almost a love affair, but not quite. I was rather enjoying the relationship. In his interview with David Sheff for Playboy in 1980, he was more direct in his denial and more ambiguous in his implication. No, we didn't have sex, but there was something. I can't describe it. Pete Shotton, Lennon's childhood friend and the author of a memoir whose reliability has been questioned, claimed that Lennon once told him he had let Epstein do something, a phrase so vague as to be almost meaningless and so loaded as to be almost unbearable. McCartney, when asked, deployed the dignified evasion that is his particular gift. They had their own relationship. It was none of my business. The temptation is to press the question, did they or didn't they? The question misses the point with spectacular completeness. Whether Brian Epstein and John Lennon shared a physical act in a Barcelona hotel room in the spring of 1963 is, in the final analysis, a matter of vanishingly little importance. What matters, what shaped both lives, and through them, the trajectory of the most important musical group in history, is the emotional reality. Brian loved John. This is not speculation. It is not inference. It is a fact confirmed by every person who knew them, as universally acknowledged as the color of the sky. He loved him with the particular intensity of a man who had been denied love so consistently, and for so long, that when it finally arrived, it arrived like a flood, overwhelming, ungovernable, impossible to contain within the neat boundaries of a professional relationship. And John knew. Of course he knew. Lennon, for all his calculated roughness, possessed an almost preternatural sensitivity to the emotions of others. He knew that Epstein loved him, and he responded with a calibration so precise that it may have been instinctive, but was no less devastating for that. He gave Brian just enough closeness to sustain hope, a private joke, a confiding glance, an arm slung around his shoulder at a party, never quite enough to constitute a promise. It was not cruelty. It was something more subtle, the behavior of a man who understood that he possessed a currency, his attention, his approval, and who spent it carefully without ever running out. Barcelona was not about sex. It was about 12 days during which Brian Epstein may have been happy. 12 days without the shop, without the contracts, without the facade. 12 days of walking beside the one person whose presence made the world feel, briefly, bearable. And then they went home, and the 12 days became a memory, and the memory became a wound that never fully closed. The return to England brought a coda that was both farcical and revealing. On the 18th of June 1963, at a party celebrating Paul McCartney's 21st birthday, a disc jockey named Bob Wooler, the same man who had announced Epstein's arrival at the Cavern 2 years earlier, drank too much and made a joke within Lennon's hearing. The exact words vary by account, but the gist was unmistakable. Something about a honeymoon, something about Eppie. Lennon's reaction was immediate and savage. He attacked Wooler with his fists, breaking several ribs and leaving him bloodied on the floor. It took 3 people to pull Lennon off. Epstein handled the aftermath with the weary efficiency of a man accustomed to cleaning up disasters. He paid Wooler £200 in compensation and compelled Lennon to write a letter of apology, which Lennon produced with all the grace of a schoolboy forced to say sorry for a fight he believes was justified. Why did Lennon react so violently? The conventional explanation is that even the hint of homosexuality could destroy a public career in 1963, and Lennon was protecting himself and the group. This is true as far as it goes. But there is another possibility. Lennon reacted not because the joke was false, but because it was close, dangerously, uncomfortably close, to something he had felt in Barcelona and did not know what to do with. The fist that broke Bob Wooler's ribs was aimed not at the man who made the joke, but at the part of John Lennon that understood it. This is interpretation, not fact. It is offered as such. The facts are a joke, a beating, a payment, an apology. The rest belongs to the silence that surrounded both men for as long as they lived. 2 months after the Wooler incident, Epstein arranged another encounter that would have consequences none of them anticipated. On the 28th of August 1964, at the Delmonico Hotel in New York City, he brought the Beatles together with Bob Dylan for the first time. It was a characteristic piece of stagecraft, identifying the 2 most important forces in popular music and placing them in the same room, then stepping back to watch what happened. What happened was marijuana. Dylan, astonished to learn that the Beatles had never tried it, rolled a joint and passed it around the hotel suite. The effect was instantaneous, and to judge by the accounts of those present, profoundly comic. McCartney raced around the room in a state of exalted revelation, announcing that he had finally understood the meaning of life. He demanded a pen and paper. A roadie was dispatched to find some. McCartney scribbled furiously for several minutes. The note, examined the following morning with sober eyes, turned out to be gibberish. At one point during the evening, and this detail has the unmistakable ring of truth, being too strange to have been invented, McCartney began shouting a single word: Jew, Jew. When the others, bewildered, asked what he meant, he explained, with the earnest solemnity of the profoundly stoned, that it was not a word but a feeling. What the feeling was, he could not further specify. Epstein laughed until he cried. It was one of the very few occasions on which those around him recalled seeing him genuinely, helplessly, unreservedly happy. Not the controlled smile of the public relations expert, not the polite amusement of the dinner guest, but real laughter, the kind that seizes the body and shakes it and leaves you gasping. For a few hours in a New York hotel room, surrounded by music and absurdity and sweet, illicit smoke, Brian Epstein was not a manager, not a guardian, not a man with a secret. He was simply a person, laughing with friends. The laughter faded, the morning came, and with each passing month, the distance between the man Brian Epstein was in daylight and the man he became after dark grew wider, until, by the autumn of 1965, the two could barely recognize each other. On the 26th of October 1965, the Beatles were driven to Buckingham Palace to receive the Member of the Order of the British Empire from Her Majesty the Queen. They wore mourning suits. They made jokes. They were, by this point, so famous that the other recipients, military heroes, civil servants, Philanthropists who had devoted decades to the public good were reduced to the status of supporting cast in the Beatles' latest production. Brian Epstein was not among those honored. He had driven them to the palace. He had ensured that their suits were pressed, and their shoes were polished, and their hair was combed to the precise angle that the cameras demanded. And then he waited, in the car, outside, while the four young men he had found in a cellar walked through the gates of the most famous residence in the world and received the gratitude of the nation. No one, as far as the record shows, thought to mention his absence. No one suggested that the man who had made the entire thing possible might deserve to stand beside them. He was where he had always been, on the far side of the door, making certain that everything on the other side was perfect. The image requires no commentary. A man waits in a car while the people he loves receive the recognition he earned. That is the whole story, compressed into a single frame. The greatest album in the history of recorded music was released on the 1st of June 1967. In 87 days, the man without whom it could never have existed would be dead. The trouble with empires is that they look most magnificent at the precise moment they begin to crack. In July 1966, the Beatles flew to the Philippines for a pair of concerts in Manila. Epstein, who handled all scheduling and protocol, had received and declined an invitation for the group to attend a reception hosted by Imelda Marcos, the wife of the country's president. He declined it, as he declined most such invitations without consulting the group, a managerial prerogative he had exercised 100 times before in 100 countries without consequence. The Philippines was different. The Marcos family did not accept refusals. When the Beatles failed to appear at the presidential palace, the national television network broadcast footage of the empty seats alongside the waiting first family, accompanied by commentary that made the snub sound less like a scheduling error and more like a deliberate insult to the Filipino people. The reaction was immediate and frightening. Tax officials materialized at the promoter's office, demanding enormous surcharges on the concert revenue. The group's police escort was withdrawn. At Manila International Airport, as the Beatles and their entourage attempted to leave the country, they were met by a hostile crowd that shoved, kicked, and spat at them. Mal Evans, the group's road manager, a gentle giant who would himself die violently less than a decade later, was struck hard enough to fall. Epstein and the others were jostled and subjected to abuse that continued until they reached the aircraft steps. The manager was shaken to his core. He had built his professional life on the principle that meticulous planning could eliminate chaos, and the Philippines had demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that this was an illusion. There were forces in the world that did not respond to politeness, to contracts, or to the measured authority of a well-dressed man from Liverpool. He fell ill afterwards, not metaphorically, but physically, retreating to bed with what was described variously as exhaustion, nervous collapse, and influenza. Those who saw him during this period said he looked 10 years older. He had barely recovered when the next crisis struck. In March 1966, John Lennon had given an interview to Maureen Cleave of the London Evening Standard in which he remarked, with the casual blasphemy that was his conversational habit, that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. In Britain, where the remark was first published, nobody cared. The English, then as now, regarded organized religion with the benign indifference of people waiting for a bus. But when the quote was reprinted in an American teen magazine 5 months later, the reaction was incendiary. Radio stations across the Bible Belt organized bonfires of Beatles records. The Ku Klux Klan nailed albums to burning crosses. Death threats arrived at the NEMS office in bundles. A concert in Memphis was interrupted by the sound of a firecracker, and every person in the building, musicians and audience alike, believed, for one frozen moment, that it was a gunshot. Behind the scenes, Epstein was frantic. He pleaded with Lennon to apologize, not because he believed Lennon was wrong, but because he understood, with the instinct of a man who had spent his life managing perceptions, that being right and being safe were two entirely different things. Lennon refused. Then he refused again. The arguments were furious, exhausting, conducted in hotel rooms and dressing rooms and the backs of cars, while outside the windows teenagers burned the records that had paid for Epstein's house. On the 11th of August 1966, at a press conference in Chicago, Lennon finally delivered something approximating an apology. It was grudging, ambiguous, and barely sufficient. The firestorm subsided. The tour continued. But Epstein knew, and Lennon knew, and in their different ways McCartney and Harrison and Starr knew that something had shifted. The machinery of control, which had functioned so smoothly for 4 years, had seized. Lennon had defied his manager in public, and the world had not ended. Authority, once challenged, is never quite the same. 18 days later, on the 29th of August 1966, the Beatles played their final concert. The venue was Candlestick Park in San Francisco, a baseball stadium with wretched acoustics and a capacity of 25,000. The set lasted 33 minutes. The screaming was so loud that neither the audience nor the musicians could hear the music. Lennon played the opening chord of I'm Down with his elbow, a gesture of contempt or despair or both. Epstein stood where he always stood, off stage in the darkness, watching. He had known for weeks that this would be the last live performance. The group had decided, collectively, irrevocably, that they would never tour again. The decision was rational. The concerts had become a pantomime of deafening noise in which the music was inaudible and the danger was real. But for the manager, the end of touring was something more than a change of strategy. It was an existential threat. A manager manages. He books venues, negotiates fees, arranges logistics, smooths relations with promoters and police and local dignitaries. Without live performances, there was nothing to manage. The Beatles were becoming a studio project, and studios required a producer, George Martin, not a man in a suit with a schedule and a telephone. Epstein's role, the very purpose that had given his life shape and meaning for 4 extraordinary years, was evaporating like water on a hot stage. His contract with the group was due to expire in October 1967. He had every reason to believe they would not renew it. Lennon had spoken, in private, about freedom. McCartney, always the most commercially astute of the 4, was cultivating relationships with other business advisors. The whisper network of the music industry carried rumors that NEMS Enterprises was in financial difficulty, rumors that were, in essence, correct. The gambling had taken its toll. The merchandising disaster had never been fully repaired. The company was spending faster than it earned. In desperation, Epstein entered negotiations to sell NEMS to Robert Stigwood, an Australian impresario who managed the Bee Gees and Cream. When the Beatles learned of the discussions, Their fury was volcanic. The idea that their manager might sell the company, and by extension, sell them, to a stranger without consultation struck at the very heart of their trust. The negotiations were abandoned, but the damage was done. The delicate web of loyalty and dependence that had bound Brian Epstein to the Beatles since that January afternoon in the NEMS office was fraying, thread by thread. It was during this period that Epstein made a remark to Nat Weiss, his American attorney and one of his few genuine confidants, that pierced through the composure he maintained in public. "What am I going to do?" He said just that, 5 words. Not a rhetorical flourish, not a dramatic gesture, but the plain, bewildered question of a man who had built his entire identity around a single purpose and felt that purpose slipping away. Before the release of SGT, Pepper, there had already been a warning. In late 1966 or early 67, the accounts differ on the exact month. Epstein was hospitalized at the Priory Clinic after what was described variously as an accidental overdose and a suicide attempt. The distinction in his case had become almost meaningless. A man who takes a dangerous quantity of sleeping pills every night is not so much choosing death as ceasing to avoid it. The Beatles visited. Lennon sat awkwardly on the edge of the hospital bed, trying to hide his concern behind black humor. "Don't be silly, Eppie," he said. "We still need someone to pay for lunch." It was the only language of care Lennon knew, tenderness wrapped in armor, affection disguised as a joke. Epstein heard what was underneath. For a few days, it seemed to be enough. Then the old darkness returned, settling over him like silt on a riverbed, and the bottles reappeared on the bedside table, and the cycle began again. SGT. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was released on the 1st of June 1967, and the world declared it a masterpiece. The critics exhausted their vocabularies. The public bought it in quantities that defied comprehension. It was, and remains, the album against which all other albums are measured, a work of such ambition and artistry that it seemed to belong not to the history of popular music, but to the history of human creativity itself. Brian Epstein had nothing to do with it. He attended a playback session. He sat in the control room at Abbey Road, surrounded by the people who had made the record, George Martin, Jeff Emerick, the 4 Beatles, and he listened. When it was over, he said it was brilliant. Then he went home to Chapel Street, to the hollow house and the bottles on the bedside table, carrying with him the knowledge that the most extraordinary artistic achievement of his generation had been accomplished without him. The boys he had found in the cellar had outgrown the cellar, and the man who had led them out of it, and the world itself. They were making art now. Art does not need a manager. Art needs only itself. The summer of 1967 was the summer of love, and Brian Epstein moved through it like a ghost at a feast. On the 7th of July, his father died. Harry Epstein, the reserved, careful man who had built the furniture business and raised 2 sons, and never, in the whole of his life, spoken directly about the thing that set his eldest apart, was gone. Whatever passed between father and son on that subject, and something must have passed, after the arrest in 57, after the court case in 58, it was conducted in a dialect of silence that certain families speak more fluently than any language. Brian sat Shiva, 7 days of mourning, as Jewish law prescribes. He sat with his mother in the house that now felt twice as vast. and he grieved for a man who had loved him in the only way he knew how, incompletely, imperfectly, but without condition. Queenie, who had lost her husband and would lose her son within 51 days, leaned on Brian's arm and wept. Who comforted him? The question recurs throughout his story like a musical phrase that never resolves. He comforted others, the Beatles, his mother, his artists, his staff. He was, by universal testimony, a man of extraordinary gentleness, quick to sense distress in others and quicker still to alleviate it. But the current of care flowed in one direction only. When Brian Epstein needed comfort, he reached for the bottles on the bedside table. 17 days after his father's death, on the 24th of July, his name appeared in the Times as one of 65 signatories to an open letter calling for the legalization of cannabis. It was a public act, his name printed in the newspaper of record associated with a controlled substance. For a man who had spent his professional life managing appearances, it was an extraordinary departure. One freedom claimed in print, another 3 days later granted by Parliament. On the 27th of July 1967, the Sexual Offences Act received royal assent. For the first time in 82 years, homosexual acts between consenting adult men in private, between no more than two people, both over the age of 21, were no longer a criminal offence in England and Wales. The law was narrow, hedged with conditions, and applied only to a fraction of the circumstances in which gay men actually lived. It was not liberation. It was a crack in the wall through which a thin blade of light fell, illuminating just enough of the room to reveal how vast and dark it truly was. Brian Epstein had lived 32 years as a criminal, not for anything he had done, but for what he was. He had been arrested, assaulted, blackmailed, and driven to the edge of destruction by a legal system that treated his capacity for love as a disease. Now, in the last month of his life, the law had relented, not with an apology, not with acknowledgement, but with a grudging, conditional permission to exist. 31 mornings remained to him. On the 25th of August, the Beatles left London for Bangor, in North Wales, to attend an introductory course in transcendental meditation led by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. They had discovered the Maharishi at a lecture and were, in the flush of enthusiasm that characterized all their collective discoveries, utterly besotted. Meditation was the new thing. India was the new destination. Everything was new, and everything was moving very fast, and Brian Epstein, who had spent 5 years controlling the direction and velocity of the Beatles' enthusiasms, was not at the center of this one. He was invited to join them in Bangor over the bank holiday weekend. He accepted. He did not go. The reasons are obscured by contradiction. He felt unwell, said some. He was expecting weekend guests at his country house in Kingsley Hill, Sussex, said others. The guests cancelled at the last minute, leaving him alone in the countryside with nothing but the stillness and the pills. He drove back to London, to Chapel Street, to the house that held no one. Saturday, the 26th of August, his last full day on earth. The morning was ordinary. He telephoned his secretary, Joanne. He telephoned Peter Brown, his closest colleague and one of his oldest friends. His voice, by their accounts, was unremarkable, neither agitated nor despairing, simply the voice of a man making routine arrangements for a weekend that would never come. He said he would drive to Sussex. He did not. At some point during the afternoon, he went upstairs to his bedroom. He closed the door. Antonio knocked in the evening. No answer. The housekeeper, accustomed to his employer's erratic habits, assumed he was sleeping and withdrew. Night fell over Belgravia. The street lamps came on along Chapel Street, casting their orange glow on the white stucco facades. Behind one of those facades, on the first floor, a door was locked from the inside. Silence. Sunday. The 27th of August, 1967. Antonio knocked again at noon. No answer. He knocked harder. Nothing. He telephoned Dr. John Galway, Epstein's personal physician. Galway arrived. Together, they stood outside the bedroom door and called his name. The house absorbed their voices and returned nothing. They broke the door down. Brian Epstein lay in bed. He was wearing pajamas. His face was calm, not contorted, not frozen in any expression of distress, but simply still, as though he had fallen asleep, and the sleep had deepened beyond the reach of waking. On the bedside table stood the familiar cluster of bottles, papers, correspondence. There was no note. The coroner, Gavin Thurston, confirmed this explicitly. No suicide note was found. The inquest delivered its verdict with the measured language of English law. The death was accidental, the accumulated effect of incautious self-overdoses of carbaryl, resulting in poisoning by a bromide compound. Not suicide. The gradual consequence of weeks, perhaps months, of escalating dosage that had overwhelmed a body already weakened by alcohol, by grief, by the particular exhaustion of a man who had carried too much for too long without anyone to help him set it down. That was the official verdict. Peter Brown, who knew him as well as anyone alive, offered a different interpretation, not publicly, not at the time, but in the years that followed. He believed the death was semi-intentional, not a deliberate act of self-destruction, but not an accident either. Something in between the behavior of a man who takes a lethal dose of sleeping pills every night, knowing that one night the dose will prove fatal, and who no longer possesses the will to care which night that is. He was 32 years old. In Bangor, the telephone rang. Jane Asher, McCartney's girlfriend, answered first. She listened. She put the receiver down. She told them. McCartney went white. He said nothing for a long time. Lennon's reaction, recorded in interviews years later, was rour. I knew we were in trouble then. It was not merely grief. It was recognition, the understanding that the single force capable of holding four divergent lives in alignment had ceased to exist. Starr wept, subdued without drama in the way that gentle men weep. Harrison said nothing at all. The Maharishi, when informed, offered words about karma and the cycle of rebirth. Lennon, who had embraced the Guru's teachings with passionate credulity only days before, responded with a profanity. It was, in its way, the most honest thing anyone said that day. The press conference that followed has been preserved on film, and it remains one of the most painful pieces of footage in the Beatles' archive. Four young men stand before a bank of microphones in a Welsh lecture hall, squinting against the flashbulbs, wearing the stunned, dislocated expressions of people who have just learned that the ground beneath their feet is no longer solid. They do not know where to look. They do not know what to say. The cameras click and whir. The microphones wait. Four pairs of eyes search the room for a fifth presence, the presence that has always been there, just beyond the frame, ready with the right word, the careful instruction. Stand here, say this, smile now. The fifth presence is gone. Without Epstein, there was no arbiter. For 5 years, he had occupied the impossible position between four colossal egos, absorbing their contradictions, translating their competing desires into a single course of action, persuading each of them, individually and in private, that the compromise he proposed was in fact their own idea. It was an act of diplomacy so sustained and so invisible that none of them fully appreciated it until it was gone. McCartney wanted to manage the group himself. Lennon wanted Alan Klein, a New York accountant with a reputation for aggressive deal-making and a manner that made strong men uneasy. Harrison wanted to be left alone to pursue his spiritual interests. Starr wanted everyone to stop shouting. The battles that followed, Klein versus Lee Eastman, McCartney's father-in-law, Apple Corps versus Common Sense, lawsuit versus counter-lawsuit, are well documented and do not need rehearsing here. What matters for the purposes of this story is the cause, not the symptoms. The Beatles fell apart because the one person who could hold them together was lying in a cemetery in Aintree. Lennon said it plainly in an interview in 1970 with the brutal honesty that was his gift and his weapon. If Epstein had been alive, the Beatles would have stayed together. He was the only one all four of us listened to. The statement has the force of an epitaph, more eloquent, in its way, than anything carved on the stone at Long Lane. In the years that followed, the decades that stretched from the 70s into the 90s, Brian Epstein disappeared. Not from the historical record. His name appeared in every Beatles biography, every documentary, every anniversary retrospective. But he disappeared from the center of the narrative. He became a footnote, a supporting character in someone else's story. The man who found them, the man who managed them, the man who died, 3 clauses in a sentence about 4 other people. The reasons for this eclipse were several, and none were accidental. His homosexuality, first. In the decades before the gradual normalization of gay identity in British public life, Epstein's sexuality was treated as an embarrassment at best, a scandal at worst, and in either case as something to be mentioned briefly and moved past. The Beatles industry, the vast, lucrative machinery of books and films and exhibitions and merchandise that kept the Fab Four alive and profitable, preferred its narrative clean. A gay Jewish manager who died of a drug overdose at 32 did not fit comfortably into the iconography of peace, love, and all you need is love. His childlessness, second. There were no descendants to champion his legacy, no son or daughter to write memoirs, establish foundations, grant interviews on anniversary dates. Queenie kept the flame, but softly, and when she died, the family's connection to the public narrative largely died with her. And his own nature, third, the quality that had defined him from the beginning and that persisted, with a kind of posthumous consistency, long after his death. He had made himself invisible. He had stood behind the cameras, waited in the car, signed the contract, and left his own copy blank. He had built an empire of fame and placed himself, by choice and by compulsion, outside its walls. When the world forgot him, it was doing exactly what he had trained it to do. The forgetting was not permanent. Memory, like water, finds its way back through the cracks. The first crack appeared in 1991 with a small black and white film called The Hours and Times that dared to imagine the 12 days in Barcelona with a quiet intensity that startled audiences. For the first time, the relationship between Epstein and Lennon was treated not as gossip, but as drama, not as scandal, but as sorrow. The film was fiction, explicitly and avowedly, but it asked a question that once asked could not be unasked. What was it like to be the man who loved John Lennon and could never say so? By the end of the 90s, the BBC had devoted its Arena documentary to his story, and for the first time the narrative was told from his perspective rather than from the Beatles. His mother spoke. His colleagues spoke. The footage of the press conference in Bangor was shown again, and this time viewers looked not at the four famous faces, but at the space beside them, the space where a fifth man should have been standing. In the new century, biographies and graphic novels began to rewrite the script. In 2000, Debbie Jeller, his former secretary, published In My Life, a biography drawn from personal archives and private correspondence, and the portrait that emerged was richer, more detailed, and more heartbreaking than anything previously available. Here was not a footnote, but a fully realized human being, brilliant, flawed, generous, self-destructive, capable of extraordinary vision and extraordinary blindness, consumed by a love he could neither express nor extinguish. In 2013, Vivek Tiwari's graphic novel The Fifth Beatle told Epstein's story in bold, saturated color, literally and figuratively. And for the first time, for a mass audience, Brian Epstein was the hero of his own narrative. Not the man who found the Beatles, but the man. The book won multiple awards. It was adapted for stage. It planted a seed. And by 2024, a blue plaque appeared on the wall of Chapel Street, 57 years after the door behind it was broken down. The plaque reads, in English Heritage's customary style, that Brian Epstein, music manager, lived and died here. A ceramic disc, no larger than a dinner plate. But it says something that the world was not ready to say in 1967. This man was here. This man mattered. Remember him. In 2024 and 2025, a feature film called Midas Man, starring Jacob Fortune Lloyd as Epstein, brought the story to cinema screens. The production had been troubled. Directors changed, schedules slipped, the pandemic intervened. But the film existed, and its existence was in itself a statement. A major motion picture about Brian Epstein, not about the Beatles with Brian Epstein in a supporting role, but about the man himself, his triumphs and his anguish, and his impossible, lopsided love for four boys from Liverpool. The world had finally turned around. He invented the profession. Before Brian Epstein, a pop music manager was a cigar-smoking hustler from a dance hall, skimming percentages and vanishing when the money ran out. After him, a manager was an architect of identity, a strategist of image, a builder of cultural monuments. The contract he drafted for the Beatles, improvised, imperfect, typed on NEMS notepaper, became the template from which an entire industry learned how to formalize the relationship between artist and representative. Every manager who followed, from every corner of the global entertainment industry, across 6 decades and counting, stands on the foundation he laid, whether they know his name or not. He did not create the music. The four of them did that, and they did it with a genius that belongs to them alone. But he created the conditions in which the music could reach the world. He took the sound of a Liverpool cellar and made it the sound of the century. Without him, the Beatles would have been the best band in Merseyside. With him, they became what they became. The difference between those two things is the difference between a street and a constellation. He paid for it with everything he had: his health, his peace of mind, his capacity to love without fear, his life. He gave the world a gift of incalculable value, and the price of the gift was himself. It was October 1967. Abbey Road Studios. The smell of warm valves and magnetic tape. John Lennon sat behind the console, and the session was falling apart. Paul wanted strings. George wanted silence. Ringo twirled his drumsticks and watched the ceiling. They had been trying to record for 3 hours, and nothing worked. Every take collapsed into argument. Every argument spiraled into stillness. Every stillness grew heavier with the weight of the thing none of them wanted to say. Lennon reached for the telephone. His hand hovered over the dial, not touching it this time, because he already knew. The number was Chapel Street, 24. He had rung it 1,000 times, at midnight, at 3 in the morning, at moments of crisis and moments of boredom and moments when he simply wanted to hear the voice of the one person who always answered. He did not dial. He sat with his hand suspended above the receiver for a long time, long enough for the others to notice and look away, because they knew the number too, and they knew what it meant that no one would ever answer it again. He was not remembering a manager. He was not thinking of contracts or costumes or schedules. He was remembering a man who had walked into a cellar on Matthew Street and looked at 4 scruffy, foul-mouthed, chip-eating boys and said, with absolute certainty, "You are the best thing I have ever seen." A man who had endured every cruelty Lennon could devise, the mockery, the needling, the casual savagery of a young genius who did not yet understand that words could wound, and had never, not once, responded in kind. A man who had loved him in a way that John Lennon, for all his extraordinary capacity for feeling, had never quite been able to return. He lowered his hand. He turned to the console. He pressed the button, and the tape began to roll, and the music continued, for a while longer, by the force of its own momentum, like the light of a star that has already gone dark. At the cemetery in Aintree, beneath the old elms, there stands a modest stone. It bears no title, no epithet, no mention of the word manager or the phrase fifth Beatle or any of the labels that the world has belatedly attempted to attach to the man who lies beneath it. There is only a name, Brian Samuel Epstein, and 2 dates. The 19th of September, 1934. The 27th of August, 1967. Between them, 32 years, 10 months, and 8 days. Between them, everything. There would have been Liverpool. There would have been a cellar. There would have been 4 gifted young men whom nobody beyond the Mersey would ever have heard. And one man in a sharp, dark suit, walking home alone through the evening streets. Alone, as always.